Welcome to the lecture for Psych through 50, Psychopersonality. I'll be talking now about Freudian theory. When we start off our discussion of theories of personality, we start with Freud's theory, which is fitting given that his is arguably the first complete theory of personality ever written down. Not that he was the first one to theorize about personality, but really the first one to come up with a fully complete theory explaining all aspects of personality from one perspective. Okay, before we get started talking about what the theory says, let's look at a little bit about the background of the theory. At one point, Freud studied under Charcot, who was a famous neurologist. And so it shouldn't be surprising that Freud himself was a neurologist. He was not, as some people think, a psychologist. There really wasn't such a thing as a psychologist at the time, at least not very commonly. It certainly wasn't a profession. So he was a neurologist, a physician, and Charcot was a rather famous neurologist who had students like Tourette, whom Tourette's syndrome is named after. But one of the things that Charcot worked on that Freud learned about was the treatment of hysteria. And hysteria, we don't refer to it as hysteria anymore, but what they refer to as hysteria, we would refer to as conversion disorder. And this is when people present with symptoms of a central nervous system problem, like paralysis or blindness, loss of some sensory or motor functioning without a clear organic cause. So like if you have glove anesthesia where you can't feel anything anywhere on your hand, that's the only loss of feeling you have. Now, we know at that time even they knew enough about the way that nerve endings worked that didn't make sense. If there was nerve damage, it wouldn't be in that pattern, which made them suspect some other non-biological cause, perhaps some sort of psychological cause. And Charcot experimented with the use of hypnosis to treat these patients and had some success with that. And Freud learned about that method. And then later Freud studied and worked with Joseph Breuer and famously wrote up the case of Anna O. And sometimes people think that Anna O was Freud's patient, but really it wasn't. It was Breuer's patient. Freud just worked with him writing up the case. And Anna O is the pseudonym they gave to Bertha Pappenheim, a woman who he was treating that had a variety of CNS symptoms, kind of hysterical symptoms. And Breuer tried a variety of things, including some medicines and also hypnosis, in working with Anna, and at her suggestion, I believe, he decided to try this kind of early version of the talking cure, where they would try to do the same stuff that they were doing before with hypnosis, trying to get at these kind of unconscious conflicts, but without the rigmarole of going through the hypnotizing process. So they would just talk, and she would reflect on things to try to get at these unconscious conflicts. And so Freud learned about this method more from Breuer, kind of the early version of free association. And it's a really interesting case, which I encourage you to read more about, learn more about, search it out, so for Anna O. or Bertha Pappenheim, because it's kind of a really important case early on in Freud's life, but one that, interesting, wasn't really successful. I mean, Anna O., she turned out to be okay, but not because of her work with Breuer. She was institutionalized and then later recovered and became a very well-known, well-respected social worker. But when working with Breuer, she actually developed a hysterical pregnancy where she believed she was pregnant with his child. She wasn't pregnant, but she felt like she was, and that led to a big scandal, and obviously Breuer's wife not happy with it and demanded that he quit working with her, and they move. So that was the end of the case. So not a success from any kind of therapeutic standpoint, but it was really influential in forming Freud's thinking, and at the time, in some circles, it was publicized as a success, and so led to more interest in what later became known as psychoanalysis. One of the things that Freud discovered when he started doing this work with hypnosis and then later with free association was that a lot of times when people had these hysterical symptoms, when he uncovered the root cause, it was often some traumatic memory, and that traumatic memory was quite often about some experience of incest, some sexual assault at the hands of a father or other male family member. And this scandalized Viennese society, European society at the time, and they said this can't be true, this can't be going on. And so actually Freud backed off from that and said, well, perhaps these aren't actual incidents, but it's incidents that they're thinking about kind of wish fulfillment, where kind of suggesting this kind of Oedipal thing going on, where they wished for attention from the father, and then had these, and then felt guilty about that impulse, and then repressed it, and then it became this memory of abuse. So he backed off his claims of incest due to social and political pressure. Which points out one of the things about Freud's theory is that it was revised multiple times over his career. There wasn't just one point in time where he sat down and wrote his theory, and here's what it is. He had multiple writings, and at each writing, things changed slightly. I think that's one reason that sometimes it's difficult to get a good handle on what Freud really said, because some of the things he said, he contradicted himself in later writings. So whenever you read anything about Freud, just realize that, okay, well, if somebody says he said this, somebody else said, oh no, he said this, and they conflict, he might have said both things, because the theory was a work in progress all the way until he died. Okay, one of the things that didn't change much over the course of his theory was this kind of topographic model of the mind, the way the mind is divided into kind of three levels of consciousness, preconscious, and unconscious. We talk about the iceberg metaphor, where consciousness, what you're aware of, so what you're thinking and feeling right now in the moment, everything that you are aware of is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more in your mind that you don't know is going on. And then just below the surface, your preconscious are things that you're not currently thinking about, but you can access. So if you are able to remember what you did for the Christmas holiday last year, and you weren't thinking about it before I said something, but you're thinking about it now it's in your consciousness. It was in your preconscious, so you're able to access it and bring it forth into consciousness. And for instance, there's some things that you're not thinking about, but you can access them, you can bring them up into consciousness. But the majority of your mind, the great bulk of the iceberg, is down there in the unconscious. Right? There are things that are going on that influence your behavior that you have no idea about. And a lot of the things that are down there, according to Freud, are kind of dark and dirty, and they're down there for a reason, because you'd be ashamed to realize that you felt or thought those things. Okay. Let's expand upon the model of the mind. Say, okay, well, beyond conscious and unconscious and preconscious, there are these three structures that emerge over time. The first of which is present at birth is the id. And the id is that part of your mind that follows the pleasure principle, that wants to feel good, that doesn't want to feel bad, and it wants to feel good now. It doesn't want to feel good later. It's like a little baby that is hungry and cries, and you say, well, I'm warming up the bottle. It'll be here in a minute, and the baby doesn't say, okay, that's fine. The baby says, no, I want the bottle now, and continues crying. That's the id. The id wants what it wants. It wants it now. So early, when you're first born, you want to feel good, and you do everything in your power to make people uncomfortable until you feel better. And when you can't do that, you might engage in wish fulfillment. And so that's whenever the baby's hungry and crying, and the parent is unresponsive, then the baby might imagine drinking a bottle and then feel somewhat better. So engage in this wish fulfillment, which is a strategy that Freud would argue that stays with us across the lifespan. But this id, and the impulses that come from the id, wanting what you want, Freud argues, is all unconscious. So you don't know what you really want. You know some version of that filters up through the ego and superego. So the superego, pick that one first. Even though I'm skipping over the ego. The ego develops before the superego, but the superego develops by age 5, and the superego is kind of an internalized parent or internalized society. So all the rules about what not to do and what's right to do, Freud would argue, is your superego. So it's not just prohibitions against, don't do this, don't do that. It's also ideals. Any kind of thing in your mind about, okay, it's good to be honest. Freud would say that's your superego, and you weren't born with it, but you learned that, you internalized it from external sources, usually the parent. And then the ego, which develops between the id and superego. So in the first 2 years, as you're interacting with the world, you're trying to get what you want when you want it. You're all id. Realistically, that doesn't happen. The world doesn't meet your needs automatically every time. And because of that, there emerges the ego, which is kind of the realistic part of your mind. And the ego's job is to balance the demands of the id, the constraints of reality, and the requirements of the superego. So the ego is the middleman, the middle person, who's trying to keep you in one piece and get what you want, but not get in trouble and get it in a realistic way. So let's say there's a plate of cookies on the table, and the id would say, I want all the cookies. Cookies are delicious, and they're yummy, and they make me feel good. I'm going to eat them all right now, and I will take them no matter what. And the superego might say, no, cookies are bad, sweets are a bad thing. You should eat fruits and vegetables, right? This is kind of ideal rules. And then the ego would say, well, there are some cookies here, so that it is realistically possible. If I take one cookie, probably nobody will get mad. If I take them all, somebody might get mad. So there's some realistic things to think about here. The id wants it. The superego says you can't have any. I think it's okay to have one. So the ego is the arbiter and kind of comes up with the compromise to keep the self from being destroyed by the conflict that arises between the id and the superego. Okay. So beyond the structural model, we kind of have an idea now of how Freud sees the mind. You've got this, you want this stuff, you're told not to have stuff, and then you have this other part of your mind, the ego, that's trying to figure out how to keep all parts of your mind happy. Well, whenever the id wants stuff, how does it want it? Where does that come from? Well, according to Freud, we're born with the id. The id has these instincts or drives, which are driven by some sort of psychic energy. And we all have finite amounts of this psychic energy that originate in the id. And then this energy is directed toward different purposes. For example, libidinal energy is directed towards seeking pleasure. And we'll talk about libido in just a minute. But I want to just kind of stop for a second and think about the context of this. When Freud was developing this theory about a finite amount of psychic energy, our knowledge of energy, physical energy, was still fairly young at this point. Einstein's theory of relativity was proposed just a few years before Freud's famous trip to America. Preceding Freud were the ideas of mesmerism, with this belief that some form of matter existed in all living things that could be manipulated via magnetic forces. Right, so there was kind of some different ways of thinking about what is energy and what is matter, and how does it relate to our psychological function. So probably to some degree, I would argue that Freud probably felt that the psychic energy was kind of as real as mechanical energy. But over time, he probably came to see it, and we see it more as a metaphor, and not as something that's a measurable energy force. Anyway, so Freud felt that there was a finite amount of this energy, again, metaphorically speaking, and depending on how it's directed, we call it different things. When it's directed toward pleasure, it's called libido, and this is the life energy or sexual energy. And the sexual aspect of it has been what's been mostly emphasized in our culture. We talk about somebody having a strong libido. We talk about being a strong sex drive. And for Freud, it wasn't just about sex. It was about pleasure, and also about life and living and growth. But again, in our Americanized version of it, we really focus on the sex part, not too surprisingly. And then an alternate drive would be that of Thanatos, the death or aggression drive, which was added as a revision to the original theory. We talked before about how the theory was revised multiple times. Originally, it was just about seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. And then he added this other idea about death and aggression, which was probably influenced by his experience, not directly but indirectly, of war, right? World War I going on around that time. But this Thanatos is a drive toward uncreating, a drive toward destroying, but also a drive for domination and power. And originally, when Freud came up with these two drives, talked about them being in opposition, so that the life force and the death force are fighting with each other. Within yourself, you want this and you want this, and they're opposite impulses. Later, in one of his revisions of his theory, he talked more about the possibility that they are intertwined, so that our behavior is influenced by a combination of aggressive and sexual impulses. You know, that sometimes we may want to feel pleasure and exert power over others, and that they're not, those impulses wouldn't be in opposition, but they might work together towards some end, driving the same behavior. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, at the beginning of this, Freud proposed that there are finite amount of psychic energy for each person. What this means is whenever some part of the mind is using a lot of energy, so if the ego needs to use a lot of psychic energy to deal with, to control or deny impulses from the id, some kind of unwanted impulses, things that would be shameful or harmful or threatening to the ego, then the ego doesn't have much energy left over to do other things. And so the purpose of an intervention for someone in this situation would be to free up the ego by dealing with these impulses, so the ego can take care of other things, day-to-day decisions. And this thinking is one way of explaining why sometimes people have a hard time making decisions when in a crisis. The idea that you have a limited amount of psychic energy, which now would probably say a limited amount of cognitive resources, arguably saying the same thing, a limited amount of ability to pay attention and think about certain things, so that if your attention and focus is really demanded in one area, you have a hard time attending to other areas of your life and or function. Okay, so you have these this libidinal and thanatotic energy with these impulses coming from the id, which aren't necessarily nice impulses. For Freud, they often seemed very not nice, although he wouldn't have characterized them that way. He thought it was natural to want pleasure and also to want to destroy, and that was in opposition to society, but it wasn't an evil thing. He didn't ascribe any kind of morality to these drives. Unless he realized that because of our place in society, having these unwanted impulses would cause problems to the other parts of the mind, to the ego. So in response to this, we develop defense mechanisms, because whenever we have these impulses, the ego feels threatened, and he coined the term neurotic anxiety. We experience this type of anxiety that we're not sure why, because again, we're not aware of these impulses, but these impulses are there, and the ego is trying to suppress them, trying to deal with them in some way, and what rises to the surface is this kind of diffuse anxiety and malaise, and we don't feel well, and it may end up turning into this hysterical symptom or some other problem. It may manifest in some other way, depending on other things that are going on in our lives. But he talked about these multiple defense mechanisms, and his daughter Anna really developed a lot of these much more later on in her career. But let's talk about a few of these, and I'll kind of give you examples and see if you can think of what I'm talking about. The first one, imagine if a young man was sexually assaulted as a child and has no memory of his childhood up through the age of 8. So what defense mechanism might that be referring to? So something bad happened, and there's no memory of it. That's most likely repression, right? which you might say, well, why do you need repression for most things if your impulses are largely unconscious? So if you want something that you shouldn't want, why do you need to repress it if it's unconscious? Well, because, Freud argues, the things in the unconscious, although we can't regularly access them, they do kind of bubble up in dreams and in Freudian slips. And it takes a lot of energy to repress them, but it works. We can repress unwanted memories, unwanted impulses. And depending on the amount of energy needed, sometimes defense mechanisms are arguably adaptive. Sometimes maybe you could say it's a good thing that someone can't remember a certain thing or is able to keep a certain impulse outside of their awareness. If it isn't causing other problems, arguably, then that's a good thing. So defense mechanisms aren't necessarily bad things and things that have to be changed in therapy. If they're working well, then they're working well. Okay, think about another one. If a woman became pregnant via an extramarital affair and then denies the pregnancy, despite having a rather large belly when before she had a flat abdomen, what defense mechanism might she be using? That would be denial, right? One of the ones that really has stayed with us in our popular lexicon. Anytime somebody is unwilling to admit that they're in an unfavorable situation, we're quick to say, oh, you're just in denial. And that comes directly from Freudian theory. And the difference between repression and denial, and they are similar. With denial, there's evidence that something is true, but we refuse to acknowledge it. With repression, there's not necessarily evidence about something, because we've repressed it. Nobody else knows. But if other people know and they will say, hey, this is what's happening, and we deny it and we're repressing it, then we call it, above repressing, we call it denial. Okay. What about if there's a therapist who writes an article, a theoretical article, wondering about the possible therapeutic impact of sleeping with a client? Not a particular client, but just a client in general. What might that be? Well, possibly intellectualization. Right? So bringing an impulse into consciousness without any affective components. So kind of, it's just this intellectual exercise. I don't really want to sleep with my client, but I'm just wondering, hey, what might it be like? So able to think about it at an intellectual level, disconnected from any affect or emotion, because the affect and emotion attached to it are threatening. And then one of the ones I think is most interesting defense mechanisms. Example would be something we see seemingly frequently, probably not that frequently. Whenever you have a politician who's stridently anti-homosexual, anti-gay rights, and then you find out that they were in a bathroom stall trying to signal another person of the same sex for a sexual act. That would be reaction formation, right? So whenever you act the opposite of an impulse, so you want something or you feel a certain way and you act the opposite way, right? You form an opposite reaction. That's reaction formation. So you hate your sister, but you act like you love her. Okay. Another one you might see in the newspapers. If there's perhaps a member of the clergy who is feeling particularly frisky, and rather than expressing that in some other way, they paint nude paintings, which are applauded and lauded as being very good and very successful. That would be sublimation. Right? So channeling id impulses into socially acceptable outlets. So if this clergy person wanted to have sex with someone or some persons and they were it was unacceptable for some reason, they related to their job, instead, rather than acting on that or thinking about that, they push that energy into some other outlet which is socially acceptable and socially rewarded. That would be sublimation. Okay, another one. What if you're angry at your sister, but you think she's angry at you? You're not angry at her because you think she's angry at you. You just think, wow, I don't really have a problem with her, but she's really angry with me. God, what's the deal? If you're doing that, it may very well be projection, right, where you attribute one of your impulses or feelings to someone else. So if you're really angry at them, you feel like they're angry at you. If you are attracted to them, you think that they're attracted to you. You project your feelings onto someone else. Okay. And then a related one, well, that's different. Imagine that you're angry kid that's angry at his or her parent, but rather than acting on that, because you might get in trouble. That's unacceptable to be angry at your parents. They get into a fight at school, beat up some other kid. So here they're not projecting. They're not thinking, oh, mom and dad are angry at me. They're displacing their anger. It's displacement onto another target. So when your impulse, it's unacceptable for the target of your impulse is unacceptable, you'll change the target to somebody who is acceptable. Usually whenever it would end poorly for us if we directed our impulses at their true targets. So being angry or lustful towards someone who it's not okay to feel that way about, displacing those feelings onto someone or something else. And the something could be an object, which would be a Freudian explanation of fetishes, which we'll talk about later in the semester. Okay. Beyond talking about the theory of the mind and how the ego tries to protect itself from these impulses, libidinal and thanatic impulses from the id, and deal with the strictures of the superego, Freud also talked about how personality develops during childhood, not over the lifespan. He's very much not a lifespan theorist, but a childhood theorist, with the idea that most of your personality is pretty well set by age 5. And the thing that creates your personality and your typical way of engaging with the world is how you deal with transitions in different phases. With the idea being that we talked before about this libidinal energy, right? That comes from the id. The anatomical focus of libidinal energy changes as you grow, and Freud probably argue that it changes with neurological development of a child, which there is some evidence for that about the way that the neurology of a child develops. A baby can't be potty trained, a small baby, because they don't have the neurological innervation to control their bowels or their bladder. It happens later in life. So there is this kind of spreading development of the neurological symptom that in some ways maps onto Freud's theory, which is interesting. But anyway, so the anatomical focus of libidinal energy changes with neurological development, and if a child gets too much or too little pleasure during a particular stage, then she or he may become fixated or stuck at that stage. And that means that they'll continue trying to seek pleasure in a way that's appropriate at that stage of development, but maybe not at a later stage of development. And this is all very symbolic. So, like at the oral stage, the first stage, whenever you're seeking pleasure through the lips, the mouth, the tongue, which if you see babies, this is the part of the body that's the nerves and the connections between the nerves and the brain are developed first. It spreads top down, middle out. So that makes sense. And babies put everything in their mouths, and they're usually big fans of eating, either bottle or breastfeeding, right? So the major crisis in the oral stage is for some babies is weaning, separating from the breast and going to the bottle. And Freud would argue that how babies deal with that, and how they deal generally with feeding issues and getting pleasure through their mouths, will affect how they are as adults. And if they get fixated, they may develop the oral personality, which doesn't mean necessarily that they'll always want to put things in their mouths, although there is that, and some people say that people who are orally fixated, people who smoke or chew gum, always have to have something in their mouth. but also at kind of a symbolic level. Think about the oral stage in infancy, in gaining pleasure via feeding, and that's kind of a dependency. So the oral person, who's fixated at the stage, remains dependent on someone else for nurturance, more so than someone who successfully resolved that stage. And then also, if the kind of problem at this stage occurred after teething, then Freud would say, that they might have problems with aggression, right? Because they might have engaged in things like biting sarcasm, because babies that teeth, they bite a lot, obviously. After the oral stage is the anal stage, so the focus of libido energy moves south to anus, and obviously the big thing to deal with here is toilet training, gaining mastery over toileting, and a lot of it's about independence. About I'm going to decide to keep my poop or let my poop go. Right. So somebody who has problems at this stage can either be anal retentive or anal explosive. Anal retentive, where they want to keep their poop and everything's going to be neat and they need lots of order and control, or the anal explosive, where the idea being that pressures in toilet training cause them to say, fine, here, you want it, you got it. And they're just kind of a messy person who doesn't care about rules or pleasing other people. After moving through the anal stage onto the phallic stage, where the libido energy shifts down to the genitals. And at this stage, this is really a big one for Freud. This is when the Oedipus or Electra complex occurs, where for the Oedipus complex, boys have sexual feelings for the mother. And again, for Freud, it's not clear that it's definitely like the boy wants to have sex with his mother, but he wants to be with the mother exclusively. Not necessarily to have intercourse with her, but to kind of romantically have that emotional attachment with her without anyone else. But this is, again, assuming an intact family, he sees this rival who shares affection with the mother, and this rival is much bigger than him. And so he develops this fear that the rival will try to hurt him if he tries to get an exclusive relationship with the mother. And for Freud, the fear is castration anxiety. And thinking, that especially if the boy sees, if he has a sister and he sees her naked, he'll think, wow, he got to her. I don't want that to happen to me. And so to resolve castration anxiety, to resolve the fear of your father cutting off your penis, if you can't beat him, join him. So you say, hey, Dad, you're my best friend. I want to be just like you. And for Freud, this is how boys get their sexual identification, how they get their maleness by successfully resolving the Oedipal complex. They identify with Dad, with a male figure, and become more masculine, and can in some way have a relationship with the mother along with the father rather than competing with him. And then if you have problems at this stage, you have problems continuing to compete with males, and possibly also problems with the mother or women who the mother serves as kind of an archetype for. And then for girls, Freud didn't talk as much about them because he was sexist, honestly. But he did offer him this analog of the Electra complex, where the daughter had, instead of castration anxiety, had penis envy. So she wished she could be like the father, right? So wish she could have a penis. And in some ways you can about that symbolically, but especially in the time that Freud lived, it makes more sense than now, where she wanted the power and independence that comes with maleness, which was very different than the experience for girls and women at that time. But wanting to be like that, but then possibly fearing the mother, but also possibly fearing not being able to do that, and then resolving this complex, this anxiety, by, again, identifying with a same-sex parent. The only way to be close to the father, who she admired and wants to be like, is to try to be more like the mother, because the father loves the mother. So I can get to the father by being like the mother, and that's how girls get their sexual identity in terms of their feminineness. Okay, so that's a big stage for Freud. But then right after that, you take a break. There comes this latency stage where libidinal energy is fairly dormant. And Freud says, oh, really? Nothing's going on. You're playing with your friends, you're going to school, no big deal. which is a weird kind of gap in his theory, but that's the latency stage, which is kind of your middle childhood. And then in adolescence, you enter the genital stage, which adolescence being the last stage of personality development. So at this point, you're done. So the focus shifts back to the genitals, but this time in a more adult way. And so the focus now is on romantic relationships with people not related to you. And so that everybody now, all of you, according to Freud, would be in the genital stage of psychosexual development. Okay, so he has a theory of the mind, he has a theory of how it gets to be that way, and there's a big emphasis, obviously, on the unconscious, and that's what causes all the problems in your life, are these unconscious impulses from the id and the conflicts that ensue between that and the things that you prohibit yourself from doing from the superego and the ego trying to make sense of it all without getting overwhelmed and destroyed. So if you got to deal with unconscious stuff, you got to find a way of accessing it. And Freud had lots of ways. He suggested that we could access the unconscious. One being dreams, right? The royal road to the unconscious, right? So the idea that when you're sleeping, you aren't able to use your defense mechanisms as well, and so those the unconscious will bubble to the surface in your mind. And even though you might not be able to make sense of your dream material, a trained analyst would be able to interpret it in terms of psychodynamic archetypes. Also talked about projective tests, which we'll talk more about in a minute, which basically just having people respond to ambiguous stimuli, with the assumption being that the unconscious material will be discernible. Free association, which was his main method of accessing the unconscious. And this is where Freud would have somebody, lie, reclined on the couch. He'd sit behind them, and he did that not to be creepy, although it is a little creepy. But he did that so that they didn't see him, so that his person, the vision of him, didn't interfere with their thinking. He wanted them to just to say whatever came into their heads, and if they're looking at him, what they say will be more likely to be influenced by him. Well, okay, there's this guy looking at me, he looks funny, he's smoking a pipe. He didn't want that. He wanted them to have kind of this blank canvas on which to write. So they would just talk, and then he would listen attentively and wait for signs that, okay, there's a leakage. It's not like you would free associate and you would go, oh my God, I can't believe it just came to me. According to Freud, you still wouldn't know that what you're saying contains clues to your unconscious, but the trained analyst could identify those things when they leaked out during this free association. Also, in the course of everyday life, sometimes he suggested that these impulses will slip out, and we call them Freudian slips. He wasn't quite that egotistical. Called it parapraxis. But like if you were ever in the first grade, maybe called your teacher mommy, that would be a Freudian slip. You kind of this wish that this teacher would be the nurturing mother figure to you, and calling her not by her name but by mommy would be a Freudian slip for a child. Another method we've already touched on, obviously, would be hypnosis. This is kind of where it started. Freud was frustrated by the limitations of hypnosis, but still felt that it could be used to get at the unconscious. Also, accidents, right? As Freud would say, there are no accidents. So if you're maybe you're supposed to meet your friend at the movies and they don't show up, and you talk to them later, like, oh, sorry, something came up, I'm really sorry. And then a week later, you're borrowing their iPad, and you drop it. Whoops. Freud would say, that's you not wanting to vent your aggression and your angry feelings to this friend for fear of losing them, or for fear of just because it's unacceptable to act that way or feel that way. So instead, you do this other thing, not consciously but unconsciously. This accident is motivated by these impulses. And then lastly, symbolic behavior. And for psychoanalysts, psychodynamic therapists, they can interpret almost any behavior to have sexual or aggressive meaning. So if you go to a pool party in summer and they're serving hot dogs, and yeah, you want a hot dog, and you say no, Very interesting. So you don't want a hot dog. What does that mean? If you want a hot dog, very interesting. So you want a hot dog. Right? So most anything can be interpreted because of some of the vagaries of the theory to have sexual or aggressive content. So those are the basics of the theory. Now let's spend just a little bit of time talking about what it's been used for. And primarily, the primary application has been for psychoanalysis, which psychoanalysis, I'd say, is not practiced hardly at all today. Psychodynamic therapy, psychoanalytic inspired therapy is practiced. Most people would refer to it as psychodynamic therapy, but true psychoanalysis is how Freud did it, and most people don't do it that way anymore because insurance won't pay for it. But the goal of psychoanalysis, this type of therapy, right, its goal was to identify unconscious conflicts. The belief being that doing so, once you have awareness, insight into the conflict, the impulse, will free up your psychic energy and allow for healthier ego functioning, right? And that will lead to the abandonment of whatever symptoms you're using as a defense against these impulses, right? Which could have been your paralysis or whatever, and also the dissipation of any kind of neurotic anxiety you were experiencing. Everything will feel much better. And how it works, primarily through free association and dream analysis. And I say it's not done anymore. This is the kind of the classic on the couch therapy. In true psychoanalysis, you meet multiple times a week for years, and people don't have time for that. They don't have the money for that, and insurance certainly will not pay for that. So I don't think anybody really does psychoanalysis anymore, but they do therapy that's influenced by psychoanalysis, but they call it psychodynamic therapy to indicate a departure from this original method. So you're free associating. He may be asking you about your dreams, and then different from some other types of therapies, Freud would interpret what you say. You'd interpret your dreams, interpret anything that you might slip out of your mouth during free associations. But one thing I think people fail to appreciate about Freud is that it wasn't just interpret everything they say, and then whenever you saw something, you jumped on it and said, you hate your mother. It was all about well-timed interpretations, and he really believed strongly in the importance of a therapeutic relationship, and that if you didn't have a good relationship with the patient and you didn't time it right, it would just cause more problems, and they would erect more ego defenses to protect themselves. And so he's not as kind of dry and clinical as I think a lot of people would believe, especially if you read some of his letters that he wrote to the people asking for help. One of his concepts was that whenever people started doing things that interfered with therapy, not showing up on time, talking about irrelevant things, kind of superficial things, I termed this resistance, and for him, he got excited. Ooh, we're getting close to something that's important, because when you get close to the id impulse, the forbidden impulse, thought, memory, whatever, resistance will get stronger. So as resistance gets stronger, you know you're doing good work, and you're almost there. When you have to push through and break through the defenses to get to that insight. Two other terms that you hear talked about with psychoanalysis and also psychodynamic therapy: transference and countertransference. Transference, Freud thought, was a helpful process whereby a client uses displacement with the therapist as the target. Right? So they transfer or displace feelings, impulses, maybe about the father, onto the therapist. So they tell the therapist, it seems you're really uncaring and cold today. And for Freud, he would think, who is it that's uncaring and cold that you're really thinking about that's not me? And he thought it was helpful because it kind of brings it into the room, and you can deal with it, whereas the actual father probably wouldn't be in the room. And then countertransference would be the therapist feeling toward the client, which Freud kind of warned therapists about. Manage your countertransference and don't let it get in the way. As we will see later, some psychodynamic therapists later said don't just worry about countertransference, pay attention to it, and it might be useful as well. How you're feeling about the client may tell you about how other people feel about the client and how the client experiences the world. Okay, beyond psychoanalysis, projective tests, another kind of practical application of Freudian theory. The rationale behind it, as I mentioned before, basically you're different types, but you're going to give somebody some ambiguous stimulus or stimuli to respond to. And the rationale, the thinking is that the person's answers will be influenced by unconscious conflicts. They can't help it because there's not a clear right or wrong answer, so it's kind of like free-associating, but free-associating in response to some stimulus. And that the trained examiner will be able to identify these if they're sufficiently knowledgeable in psychodynamic theory. Some examples of projective tests. Two of the big ones. One, the Rorschach ink blot test, where as the name implies, you show people ink blots and tell me what you see. And they generate as many responses as they can, and you analyze the data that you gather from their responses. Another one, the thematic apperception test, the TAT, where you show people pictures, black and white pictures of kind of ambiguous situations. It's not clear. Maybe there's two people in it. Maybe they're angry at each other. Maybe they're sad. But you tell the person, tell me a story about this picture with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Tell me what the people are thinking and feeling. Right? So they have to fill in the blanks. And the idea being that since there's not a clear story there, whatever they say won't be as much about the card or the picture as it is about what's going on inside of themselves. Now, in terms of the validity of projective tests, it really depends on the method of interpretation. For example, with a Rorschach ink blot test, I don't think anybody gives the Rorschach and just kind of gives the ink blots and says, "What do you see?" And then based on it, they go, you said this. That's interesting. I think it means this." It's not that level of interpretation. There are different ways of interpreting the Rorschach. The most common would be Exner's system, which is very, very tedious, but involves scoring a lot of things about their responses, not just what the response was like, but things like what parts of the ink blot did they use? Did they use the dark spaces? Did they use the clear spaces? What kind of content did they see? Did they see animal? Did they see science? Did they see human figures? Did they use the colored portions of the blot, or did they avoid using the colored portions of the blot? Did they use major details? Did they use minor details? And based on this, there's kind of some statistical formulations related to normative data, which is a bunch of people's responses and what the average response is and the average number of responses, things like that. You come up with some ideas about not just what they said, but how they said it and how they were processing the information. So whenever they see the world, how do they make sense of it? But again, there are multiple ways to interpret Rorschach responses, and depending on which way you use, some ways have more support, empirical support, than others. Same goes for the thematic apperception test. There are some methods where you're looking for specific presses, where you're looking for, okay, are they in themes? But other people will say, well, I'm just kind of interested in what the story says. And depending on what method you use, it will be more or less supported empirically. So given the variability in the validity of the use of these methods, what can it be used for? Well, I would argue that it does have some utility, probably questionable utility for diagnosis. Definitely wouldn't use it, trying to make some decision about whether a child should go with the mom or the dad at the divorce hearing, right? I wouldn't use projective tests for that, because the validity is a little too murky, even for the stuff that has good support. It's still a little bit murky. But that aside, it can be very helpful in therapy for some therapists and some clients, and not even so much the product of the testing. So not so much what you learn, but the process of doing it. Sometimes in the process of someone trying to make sense of a story and talking about it, they'll remember other things and start talking about some other relationship or experience, and that'll take you down a path that's therapeutically important and that you wouldn't have gotten to if you hadn't used that approach. So its utility for assessment, it's a little suspect, but I think its utility for therapy is a bit stronger and probably can be is more easily supported. So we've talked about the uses of the theory. We've talked about all the different aspects of the theory. Let's talk a little bit about the good and the bad. The good, it's foundational, right? Every personality since talks about how they're different from Freud's theory, and so you can't have the new without reacting to the old. It's all based on this other context. Okay, so Freud said this, but I think it's really this. So they're not defining themselves in and of themselves, but in comparison to this other existing theory. It's kind of funny, but the controversy that Freud generated was really good for psychology and for behavioral science, because some of the things that were so fantastic, and not fantastic good, but fantastic in terms of, oh my God, I can't believe you said that. It caused people to say, well, we better find out if this is true, because I don't think that's true. Let's do some research. And more opinions got out there, and people started working toward trying to figure out what people are like and why they are that way. So it really kind of provided this impetus towards research and theories. And it continues to influence our thinking and writing, not just in our field, but in popular culture especially. Especially in America, Freud's ideas have really permeated our society and have had a lasting impact. So in that way, it's important to know about. That being said, scientifically, there's some problems. Falsifiability being a big one. Because for a lot of things that Freud says, like if you're fixated at a certain stage, you can either be anal retentive or anal explosive, and those are two opposite outcomes. How can that's not really a falsifiable hypothesis? If this bad thing happens at this point in time, you're either going to be this way or this way. Well, then Freud really can't be wrong, right? Because you're one way or the other, or some degree of one or some degree of the other. So it's not a falsifiable hypothesis. A lot of hypotheses that can be drawn from Freud's theory are difficult to test and difficult to falsify, and they deal with kind of fuzzy concepts. And a lot of that has to do with the language that they chose to use, which is a product of the time. Another criticism of Freud's theory is that he's really attempting to generalize a good deal from pathological cases to normal personality. So his theory is based on clients. He didn't interview a lot of well-functioning people. He worked with people who presented with problems, who perhaps met criteria for what we call today a psychological disorder. And based on those experiences, generated this theory of personality that applies to everyone. And that may not be the best way to understand typical personality or normal personality development based on what are possibly atypical cases. Also, of course, relied heavily on case study data. Didn't conduct any kind of large blind experiments and anything like that. And there's a bias inherent in case study data. Whenever he's treating someone and they're giving him information in their free association or whatever, he's hearing themes that he's looking for, and he's going to miss things that he's not listening for. And that's just the nature of having one person be the gatekeeper to the data, which is what case study frequently involves. And then the last criticism of Freud, which I find somewhat amusing, is that he didn't think of everything. A lot of people that came since Freud said, okay, well, he talked about this and this, but he didn't talk about this. Oh, he didn't talk about this. In some ways, yeah, they're right, but I think that's one of the probably unfair criticisms of Freud, because you can't think of everything, and he really was the first one to develop this systematic theory of personality, and so to fault him for not addressing certain issues, I think is a little silly, although it is important to point out where more research is needed. Okay, wrapping up, what you should know about Freud. the key components of the theory. So how the mind is structured, conscious, preconscious, unconscious, and then the structure of the mind as well, and the role that each of those structures plays. How the ego defends itself against id impulses, those defense mechanisms. A little bit about the psychosexual model. Right? Obviously know that the id has these impulses, which depending on the direction of the impulse, we talk about it being from the libido, the life, sex drive, or the thanatos, the death, aggression drive. Be familiar with the application of the theory, which involves psychoanalysis and projective assessment. And then, as best you can, try to understand the pluses and the minuses, the strengths and weaknesses of Freud's theory. So how was it good to have this theory, which is kind of the foundational stuff? What are the weaknesses of it? And the other thing I think is hard to think about is what contributions did Freud make that are really lasting? Not just, oh, he did this first and it was good, but what things did he say, like, well, that's still somewhat true, and it's good that he pointed that out, because that's an area that we're still focusing on, and seems to be an accurate understanding of personality. All right, that's it for now. Take care.